absolutely no right to butt into my work like that and take over like I don't exist.
Look.
No, you look. I am a grown woman. But as long as you keep insisting on treating me like a child, I want you to stay the hell out of my life.
She was hiding two things at once, and only one of them had a name doctors could write down. In 1992, at the exact peak of her second hit show, Kristy McNichol walked off a sitcom set and never really came back to acting. For years, her publicist gave one explanation. The truth came out almost a decade later, and even that wasn't the whole story. There was a second secret underneath the first one, something she carried quietly for 20 more years before she finally said it out loud. This is what was actually going on. A breakdown filmed in France. The part of this story most people never hear about happened on a movie set in the French Alps in 1982, 2 years before the film even came out. Kristy McNichol was filming a drama called Just the Way You Are, playing a young musician learning to live with a physical disability. It should have been just another role for a 20-year-old who'd already won 2 Emmys. Instead, something broke. She stopped sleeping. When she did sleep, the nightmares came. She cried on set, between takes, during scenes, during nothing at all. When the production broke for Christmas, she went home and didn't come back. Filming had to shut down completely. Production stayed frozen for an entire year while she went through treatment, and the studio had no choice but to wait, because there was no version of finishing that movie without her in it. Here's the detail that the tabloids ran with at the time. They called it a chemical imbalance, vague enough to sound clinical without explaining anything. People whispered about substances. People whispered about alcohol. None of it was true. And McNichol said so herself later, pointing out that an addiction would almost have been easier to escape than what she was actually dealing with. What she was actually dealing with had 2 layers, and for years, only Kristy and the people closest to her knew there were 2. The job that started before she could read. To understand how a 20-year-old ends up collapsing on a film set in another country, you have to go back to where this entire career started, because it started absurdly early. Kristy McNichol was born in September of 1962 in Los Angeles, the daughter of a carpenter and a woman who worked as a secretary and sold cosmetics to keep the family afloat after a divorce split the household when Kristy was only 3 years old. She had 2 brothers. Jimmy, older by about a year, was the one who got pulled into modeling and commercials first, and Kristy tagged along, not even old enough for kindergarten. By 6, she was shooting her first commercial. The 2 of them became something of a package deal for advertisers throughout the late 60s and early 70s, showing up together selling toothpaste, cereal, anything that needed 2 photogenic kids on screen. Their mother eventually transitioned from secretary work into managing both of their careers full-time, since by the early 70s, the auditions had turned into actual paying work. And the paying work had turned into something the whole family was now financially leaning on. By her early teens, Kristy had already done guest spots on shows like Starsky and Hutch and The Bionic Woman, the kind of credits most adult actors spend years chasing. Before any of that, in 1974, she landed her first real series regular role, playing Patricia Apple on a CBS drama called Apple's Way, about a city family relocating to small-town Iowa. The show didn't last, but it gave Kristy something rare for a child actor. An actual television resume before she'd even turned 13, and a level of professional comfort on a set that most kids her age simply never got the chance to build. She and Jimmy also tried their hand at music, recording an album together in 1978 that produced a minor charting single, a cover of an old girl group song. It wasn't a massive hit, but it added another layer to how the public saw her. Not just an actress, but a genuine teen idol with range. Someone magazines wanted on their covers regardless of what she was actually promoting that month. Then, in 1976, at 13 years old, she landed the role of Letitia Buddy Lawrence on the ABC drama Family. It wasn't a sitcom kid role. The show dealt with divorce, identity, and the messy parts of growing up that most family television at the time pretended didn't exist. And Buddy was written as genuinely complicated, sensitive, sharp, occasionally lost. McNichol played her so convincingly that critics kept describing her work as something beyond acting, closer to just being herself on camera. She won 2 Emmy Awards for the role, in 1977 and again in 1979, before she'd even gotten her driver's license. At the time, no one had ever seen a performer that young win the award twice for the same role, and the show's writers leaned harder into Buddy's storylines specifically because McNichol could carry material most teenage actors simply couldn't handle convincingly. By the time the show ended in 1980, Kristy McNichol was 18 years old and had been working professionally for over a decade. She'd never had an ordinary adolescence to compare it to. She'd only ever known one mode: deliver, perform, don't complain. Nobody told her she could say no. When family rap, there was no break built in. Hollywood doesn't pause for child actors to figure out who they are once the cameras stop rolling. If anything, success makes the offers come faster. That same year, McNichol starred opposite Tatum O'Neal in Little Darlings, playing a streetwise teenager hiding real vulnerability underneath the toughness. The film turned her into a full-blown teen icon, and critics singled her out specifically, noting that her performance made audiences want to see whatever she did next. She kept saying yes. Later that same year, she appeared in The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia, alongside Dennis Quaid and Mark Hamill, earning one of the highest paychecks any teenage actress had landed up to that point. The next year, she took on an even heavier role in Neil Simon's Only When I Laugh, playing the daughter of a recovering alcoholic, a performance that earned her a Golden Globe nomination. From the outside, it looked like an unstoppable run. From the inside, McNichol has said she genuinely didn't know how to turn anything down. Not a script, not a press tour, not her own mother, who was also managing her career and depending on her income to support the household. The roles kept compounding the pressure instead of letting her breathe between them. And by 1982, with a panned musical comedy called The Pirate Movie, for years, finally reached the surface. That same year, she went to France for Just the Way You Are, the part of the story she didn't tell yet. When McNichol finally returned to finish the film after her year away, she came back changed, and so did the way Hollywood talked about her. Doctors at the time described what she was going through using vague, softer language: exhaustion, anxiety, emotional strain. None of those words was a lie exactly, but none of them captured the full picture either, because there was a second pressure running underneath the obvious one, and McNichol wouldn't speak about it publicly for another 3 decades. She has said the breakdown wasn't just about overwork. It was also about the exhausting effort of hiding her sexuality from a public and an industry that she didn't trust to accept it. Imagine carrying that secret at 20 years old, on a film set in a foreign country, surrounded by a crew and a studio that already controlled every other part of your life, with no space left to even admit what was actually wrong. The public got chemical imbalance. What she was actually managing was burnout stacked directly on top of fear. She finished the film. It came out in 1984 to muted reception, audiences sensing something raw and unresolved in her performance without knowing why it felt that way. For a while afterward, she tried to keep working. Smaller films, a few television movies that came and went without much notice. The industry had quietly moved on without saying so out loud, and so in a different way had she. At one point during this stretch, she stepped away from acting entirely for a short while and actually trained and worked as a hairdresser. A strange and almost unimaginable detour for someone who'd been one of the most recognizable faces in America only a couple of years earlier. It wasn't a publicity stunt or a reinvention story arc. It was simply someone trying to find out if there was a version of her life that didn't involve being watched. She came back to acting again not long after, picking up smaller roles in films that mostly came and went without much attention. A noticeable come-down from the Emmy-winning, Golden Globe-nominated run she'd had only a few years earlier. A diagnosis that finally had a name. The years following her return from France were quieter publicly but harder privately. McNichol has described battling insomnia, sudden mood swings, and stretches of overwhelming sadness that didn't match anything happening around her. The kind of pattern that eventually led doctors to a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, though it would take years before she'd say that word to the public herself. Through that stretch, her brother Jimmy stayed close, moving in with her at points to help her get through the worst days, cooking, managing the household, simply making sure she wasn't alone with it. It was, by her own account, one of the only times in her adult life someone was actively taking care of her instead of the reverse. A strange reversal for someone who'd effectively been the responsible one in her own household since childhood. In 1988, something steadier finally arrived. NBC cast her as Barbara Weston on Empty Nest, a spin-off of The Golden Girls, playing a police officer living with her widowed father. It wasn't heavy material like Family had been. It came with an established, supportive cast and the rhythm of a hit sitcom airing right alongside one of the biggest shows on television, and for a performer who'd spent years carrying heavy dramatic material, the lighter tone was its own kind of relief. For a few years, it looked like things had genuinely stabilized. The show ran for 7 seasons total, and for much of that run, McNichol seemed to fans like she'd found exactly the kind of professional home that had eluded her since Family ended. They hadn't stabilized entirely, not underneath the surface. The same waves that had pulled her under years earlier kept returning quietly, even while audiences watched her deliver a steady, funny performance every single week, without any visible sign of what was actually happening once the cameras stopped rolling. The walk away, nobody got an explanation for. In 1992, midway through the show's 5th season, Kristy McNichol left Empty Nest with no real public explanation. Her publicist gave a brief statement citing health reasons and nothing more. No interviews, no follow-up, no detail. For a star who had been a fixture on American television for almost 2 decades, the silence was jarring, and it left exactly the kind of vacuum tabloids love to fill with guesswork. It would take nearly 10 years for the real reason to surface. In 2001, McNichol confirmed publicly that she had been diagnosed with what was then commonly called manic depression, bipolar disorder in today's terms, and that the diagnosis, not scandal, not addiction, not burnout alone, was what had actually pulled her off that set in the middle of a hit show's run. She said she simply wasn't ready to discuss something so private back when it was happening, but that enough time had passed that she wanted people to hear the truth from her directly rather than keep guessing. That disclosure mattered beyond her own career. In an era when mental illness, especially something as stigmatized as bipolar disorder, was rarely discussed by famous people in public at all, McNichol naming her own diagnosis was a quiet kind of risk. She came back once more, briefly, for the Empty Nest series finale in 1995, giving fans something like a proper goodbye. After that, she only voiced a couple of animated characters in the late 90s, and then she was simply gone from screens for good. On her own terms this time, not because anyone made her leave. The second secret, finally spoken. In the years after she left Hollywood, McNichol built an ordinary life out of the wreckage of an extraordinary one, teaching acting at a private school in Los Angeles, filling her days with yoga, tennis, and a house full of rescue dogs, particularly a soft spot for miniature dachshunds. She's said plainly that her dogs never cared whether she was famous, which is exactly the kind of indifference she'd spent her whole life never getting from anyone else around her. Her students, by most accounts, valued her honesty about the industry just as much as anything she taught them technically. She'd lived through the version of Hollywood that chews people up, and she didn't pretend otherwise in front of a classroom. But for 2 decades after she stepped out of the spotlight, she kept one more piece of her story private, the same piece that had partly driven her toward that breakdown in France all those years earlier. For most of her career, speculation about her sexuality had simply floated around unanswered, the kind of rumor tabloids loved hinting at without ever confirming, and McNichol never engaged with any of it publicly, one way or the other. Then, in January of 2012, at 49 years old, she chose to finally say it herself, publicly, through her representative. She was gay, and she had been living with her partner, Marty Allen, since the early 1990s. It wasn't framed as a comeback or a press strategy. It was a short, direct statement, and the reason she gave was about other people more than herself. She wanted young people who felt different, especially those facing bullying over their sexuality, to know they weren't alone. The timing mattered too. Coming out at 49, after decades of staying silent on the subject entirely, meant she was speaking from the other side of exactly the kind of fear she was hoping to help other people avoid. Marty Allen, for her part, has never sought any spotlight of her own. She'd worked in television and behind-the-scenes entertainment roles years earlier, but by the time the relationship went public, she'd moved into a quieter, private life entirely separate from Hollywood, and she's stayed there since, declining to comment on the relationship in any real detail even after the announcement made headlines. Friends close to the couple have described their decades together as steady and largely uneventful in the best possible sense. Two people who built a life around routine, privacy, and each other, with none of the chaos that had defined McNichol's career. By the time that announcement came, Allen had already been the steady presence through every chapter that mattered. Through the years, McNichol calls the hardest of her life. Through her exit from Empty Nest, through the slow process of building a new identity once the cameras stopped. McNichol has since described her home life as calmer and steadier than anything in her career ever was, crediting that directly to the life she and Allen had quietly built together long before anyone outside their circle knew to ask about it. Where the story actually lands. Today, Kristy McNichol is in her 60s, still living in Los Angeles, still occasionally teaching, still appearing at fan conventions where people who grew up watching Family or Empty Nest line up to tell her what her work meant to them. Her net worth, built mostly off royalties from decades-old work, sits somewhere in the millions, though that's never been the part of her life she measures herself by. She said the years after leaving Hollywood have felt happier and more settled than almost anything that came before. The kind of ordinary contentment that never once showed up in the headlines written about her during her actual fame. She's talked about loving simple things now, traveling when she can, singing for no reason other than enjoying it, living at a pace that has nothing to do with call sheets or contracts. What defines her story isn't the disappearance itself, it's what was true underneath it the whole time. A kid who started working before she could really consent to it, who carried her family's finances before she was old enough to drive, who broke down on a film set partly from exhaustion and partly from hiding something about herself she didn't yet feel safe naming, and who eventually chose, twice on her own timeline, to tell the truth anyway. Once about her diagnosis, once about who she loved. Both times, she waited until she was the one deciding when, rather than letting a tabloid or a leaked story make that decision for her, which is its own kind of quiet control after a childhood where almost nothing about her life was actually in her own hands. She didn't vanish because Hollywood pushed her out, and she didn't vanish because of scandal. She left because staying would have meant hiding two things that were quietly destroying her at once, and she finally decided her own peace mattered more than anyone else's curiosity about her. 3 decades on, the woman millions of people once knew only as a character on a screen turned out to have a far more ordinary, far more human story underneath the fame than anyone watching at the time ever got to see. So here's the question worth sitting with. If Kristy McNichol had felt safe enough to tell the truth about either secret 10 years earlier, would Hollywood in that era have let her stay? If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales. And hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.